And we're back with Pirkei Avo. We're so excited. We are now going to be chapter 5, Mishna 18. And we dedicate this episode in memory of Levy ben Moshe Esther and Elishev ben Levy. And also in memory of Shlomo ben Moshe Esther. I'm going to hand you over to Michael.
Thank you, Rav Mashiach. So in this Mishnah, which I believe is the last of these 4 types series, so this deals with 4 types of people who sit in front of scholars. So these are the attitudes, the attitudes of the students. And let's go start the Mishnah. Arba midot biyoshvim lifnei chachamim. There are 4 types amongst those who sit before Torah scholars. Sfog, a sponge. Umashchei peich, a funnel. Meshameret, a strainer. V'nafa, and a sieve. Sfog, shehu sfog et hakol. A sponge, it soaks everything up. Umash peich, shemachnim bazo umotzi bazo. It takes in a funnel, it takes in at this end and lets out at that end. Mesha meret shemotzia et hayayin v'koletet et hashmarim. A strainer, it lets the wine through and retains the lees or dregs. V'nafa, a sieve, shemotzia et hakemach v'koletet et hasolet. A sieve, it lets the flour dust through and retains the fine flour. So, as we mentioned, this most likely refers to students, but I'm going to bring an alternative explanation later on in this Mishnah. But let's again look at the qualities of these different types of attitudes of absorption or editing, so to speak. So firstly, a sponge. We know a sponge will soak up everything. So everything that the teacher is expounding, whether it be useful or not, is retained. And the sponge becomes heavy with information. And it becomes full of information. And secondly, the concept of a person who acts like a funnel, whose mind is like a funnel. It takes it in at one end and immediately expels or lets out through the other end. The third student is like a strainer. It says in the Mishnah, it lets the wine through and collects the dregs. So this is a student that retains what isn't desirable. Like a wine sieve would collect the particles that are of no use to anybody. Perhaps in this instance, this student retains things that really miss the point completely. And the final example is a sieve. It lets the flour dust through and retains the fine flour. This is the best of all attitudes and discernations, where the student will really understand the essence of what is being taught and will perhaps discard what is unnecessary. Therefore, a nice clean understanding of what's being taught, not cluttering like with the sponge. Perhaps it's cluttered.
Also with the sponge, sponge can soak up, but because the sponge is porous, one squeeze and everything goes out.
That's very true.
If that's any,
yeah, that's very true. So let's have a slightly more analytical look at this. So a sponge will collect unnecessary information, and there's no kind of discerning of what is useful. And ultimately, even though it's full of information, the student may not really understand what the true message or the essence of the information is. The second example is the funnel, and that seems to be a student who's not interested in understanding, and it just one ear, out of the other. The third example of a strainer this is perhaps a negative person, a person who will be taught a lesson, but he will only take a negative aspect of the lesson. Like, oh, the person is telling me a lesson, but look at the way he's talking. Look at the attitude that the person is teaching. He's trying to force this information on me. Or, you know what, I don't believe in this. I think he's, I think this information is wrong, and I don't accept it. Or he just absorbs completely the wrong message from what is being taught to him. But there's always, that sounds like a very bad example of how to what to retain. And the last example, he retains and understands the essence of what is being taught. Now, there is, I don't know if it's Midrash Shemuel or another commentary, but someone notes that the Mishnah may be talking about parents and children. Now, this is very interesting. Let's take the first case of the sponge. This is a child who will eventually become a carbon copy of the parents in morals and attitudes, but perhaps also in any deficiencies or anything that was maybe not particularly good in the parents. He'll retain it and he'll display that to his children. The second is the funnel. This is someone who doesn't want anything to do with his parents. Looks at the older generation as old-fashioned, and all he wants to do is get old enough to be able to move out. This is someone who's not interested, just one ear in one ear, out the other. The third is the strainer. This is someone who really takes the very worst of what's being taught, or just takes things very negatively and will end up only taking the worst or negative aspects of his upbringing, and perhaps will pass that on to his or her children. The sieve is the best of them, and will take everything that was good from his or her parents and adapt it, shake off what is unnecessary, and adapt it to the new generation. Perhaps it's his or her children, and will bring the total good learnings gleaned from his or her parents and adapt it to a new modern generation. And one last thing I'd like to actually point out. This is from Midrash Shemuel. Points out that our Mishnah simply gives the four metaphors, but makes no explicit judgments on which are good and which are not. We may therefore assume that all four types are of value. The sponge is obviously of worth. Through a history stretching over millennia, he is the important, as we learned in the Avot chapter 2, Mishnah 11, I think it's Rav Eliezer, who is a cemented cistern that will not lose a drop. Yeah. He was quoted by his teacher, Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, correct, exactly, as he was the first of the 5 pupils, and he was a cemented cistern that will not lose a drop. Perhaps this could be compared to the sponge, because that's what. And whatever unimportant or trivial material may be in such a mind, all important knowledge is also there. The second, the funnel, too, can be considered useful according to Midrash Shemuel. A funnel is wide at the top and narrow at the bottom to help transfer liquids from large containers to smaller ones. In Jewish scholarship, there is an analogous need for popularizers, or authors and speakers who can funnel the Torah wisdom of past and present, gather it from a broad range of thought, and present it understandably and attractively to Jewry at large. By definition, the sponge simply absorbs and retains. This type of scholar will not readily pass on to others the fruits of his knowledge, studies and insights. So the funnel type is a needed type. Similarly, the strainer that holds back the sediments and dregs and lets only the wine through may denote the popularizer, who by written or spoken word brings his fellow man the pure wine of our heritage. He does more than the funnel. He holds back and sifts out those elements that would strike today's reader or listener as dregs or sediment. It does our heritage no good to include at once elements for which the modern temper is not ready. So in general, the strainer suggests the editor who can select and arrange with care. Today's reader has a short attention span and can take only digests. There is a need to select the essence of Judaism, the basic elements of our faith, and present them in highly readable or listenable form to the many in Jewry who would want to come and listen to shiurim or read lessons or read books. And finally, the sieve. This is an example of the valuable scholar of this type. An example would be Rabbi Solomon Gansfried, who is the author of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Out of the vast Talmud and its many commentaries, out of the giant codes of the Jewish law that preceded him, he chose the heart of the wheat, the very basic laws, norms and procedures that the non-scholar should know to achieve a fair degree of observance and piety. Whatever he omitted, he could safely leave to the sage and scholar to learn from earlier sources. His became the handbook, the invaluable guide to piety for generations of grateful Jewry. So that is basically Midrash Shmuel describing these four conditions. Categories, and that concludes this Mishnah.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Michael. Interesting, these Mishnah in groups of 4. Next time we convene Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to do the Avashe to Teluya B'davar, the love that is dependent on something else, a causative factor, which is of course a very important Mishnah. We're going to make examples from Tanakh, but until then we wish you a wonderful and blessed week.